listening to A Bit Easier podcast, a space where we dive into science-backed tools to help you organize your life, take care of your health, and stay productive. In each episode, we explore ideas and strategies that make life feel a little simpler and more fulfilling. I'm Anna Kovalenko, a coach with a deep passion for behavior design. I truly believe that change is possible without forcing yourself, as long as you use the right strategies. And that's exactly what this podcast is here for, to share those tools with you in a clear, relatable way. So let's take this journey together. Every episode is one more step toward living life just a bit easier. Have you ever stopped to think that only humans are truly capable of self-awareness? The ability to reflect, notice our mistakes and successes, assess our skills, and have an inner dialogue, these are uniquely human traits. But how do they actually work? Why do some people seem to make thoughtful, well-informed decisions while others struggle? Why do some of us learn from mistakes while others keep repeating them? And why does overconfidence help some people move forward but lead others to fail? These are the kinds of the questions explored by the science of metacognition, or simply thinking about your own thinking. It means we don't just make choices, but we also reflect on how we make them, how confident we feel, and whether we could do better. Metacognition helps us understand the limits of what we know, and once we learn how it works, we can use it to improve how we think, learn, and make decisions. For most of us, this process feels automatic, something we do without thinking. But if we want to get better at it, we first need to understand what's going on under the surface. That's exactly what today's guest studies. Professor Stephen Fleming is principal investigator at the Wellcome Center for Human Neuroimaging, where he leads the metacognition group. He's also the author of No Say Self, a book about the science of self-awareness. In this episode, we talk about why overconfidence can be misleading, how being too self-critical can hold us back, and how stress and anxiety affect our ability to notice mistakes and build real confidence in our decisions. But before we dive in, a quick note. If you haven't subscribed to A Bit Easier yet, make sure to do so on your favorite podcast app. And if you find this episode helpful, leaving a rating or a like really helps more people discover it. Alright, let's get into my conversation with Steve. Steve, it's a pleasure to have you on my podcast, and I'm super inspired to have this conversation today. And I really admire how you explain complex terms in simple language, and you've done it perfectly in your book, which I read. And our topic today may seem difficult to grasp, so to start, could you give us your definition of metacognition?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a pleasure to be here and be recording this with you. I approach this from the perspective of cognitive neuroscience. So we study how the mind is supported by the brain, and we're very interested in one aspect of that, which is, as you say, metacognition, and that's the capacity that humans have to think about and reflect on how our minds are working. So a useful way of understanding what metacognition is to give a concrete example. So imagine you're revising for an upcoming exam. You might think to yourself, do I know this topic well enough or not? Mm-hmm. So that would be a metacognitive judgment of your memory. And as that example shows, metacognition has a big role to play in guiding our behavior and enabling successful performance in a range of areas of life.
And we could say that metacognition is the same as self-awareness, yeah?
Yes, broadly speaking, that psychologists often reserve the term self-awareness to mean conscious knowledge or awareness we have of our behavior, of our personalities, of our bodily and emotional states. And metacognition is an important part of that. Mm-hmm. But we also think metacognition can sometimes proceed unconsciously. So on a more implicit level, the brain might be able to monitor, say, how you are performing on a task without that necessarily becoming consciously aware. So we draw a distinction between what we call implicit metacognition which is metacognition that's kind of running behind the scenes, and conscious self-awareness. What's interesting is that early in life, there are signs of implicit metacognition in very young babies, but it's not until the age of around 4 or 5 years old that children gain the conscious ability to think about their own knowledge and their own minds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. And several years ago, you recorded some podcasts when you were presenting your book, and you talked about your son when he was 3 and that he didn't have that explicit metacognition yet.
That's right. Yeah. He's now 5, and he probably has a bit more. Back then, he definitely didn't have any. Yes.
And I've also checked with my friend who has a son of age 2, and she also said, yeah, it works like that, so they don't understand that they don't know something yet.
Absolutely.
Okay, so thank you for the explanation. And this concept of self-awareness, if we talk about explicit metacognition, is discussed a lot in mass media, and it's common to come across some posts that say things like practice self-reflection or be mindful. But in your book, you highlight an important point that while we are often urged to have better self-awareness, little attention is paid to how it actually works. So could you explain in simple terms how self-awareness functions?
Yeah, so I think that a useful analogy here is that there is, as you say, a lot of recognition in popular culture, in education, in the workplace now, especially with the rise of AI. The idea that being metacognitive or being self-aware of our skills and capacities is something good and that we should try and improve. I think that is widely recognized. But my point on the importance of understanding mechanism is similar to why you wouldn't go, if you wanted to start training at a gym, you would want to know something about what are the best exercises to do. And you would want to ground that in some kind of science about what's going to help you get fitter and stronger and so on. And I think we're in a similar position with the science of metacognition. People recognize it's a good thing to try and do, but we have very little understanding of the mechanisms, the science behind what works, what doesn't work. And so in our lab, we're very interested in trying to fill in that picture. If we can understand the mechanisms that support good metacognition, then we should be able to devise better ways of improving it. And I mean, this is not really answering your question. I'm just trying to explain why it's important to understand mechanism. I think to get to your question about how we think it works, this is an ongoing scientific project. This is something that's certainly in its early stages. In neuroscience, people have been studying functions like vision or memory or how we move our bodies for decades, and we have a reasonably good understanding of how those kind of functions work in the brain. But it's really only the past 20 years or so that we've started studying metacognition. So we're at a much earlier stage of the science. I think some of the lessons we have learned from that work is that what's important for metacognition are brain systems that are involved in tracking our confidence or uncertainty about other brain processes. So we know that when we ask people to reflect on how they're doing on a simple task, they reliably activate parts of their brain in the prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex that are involved in abstract thought, in integrating different aspects of how the brain is working and building up an internal model of how our memories or decisions are contributing to our behavior. And what's interesting is that those regions are also very active when you're just resting, when you're doing nothing. And one interpretation of that is that when we're resting and doing nothing, we're often thinking about ourselves. We're often thinking about how our lives are going, what we need to do next, and so on. And so the focus of our work has been trying to understand how those brain networks that are involved in thinking about yourself, what are they really doing? And one powerful perspective on this is that they're involved in making predictions about your success on a variety of different tasks that you're performing and tracking without you getting external feedback. They're able to build up a model of your skills and capacities in different areas of life.
And that's something that differs us from other species, yes? So that's something that only humans can do.
Well, not quite. So it used to be thought that metacognition was uniquely human and it's only and other animals don't have it. But we now know from a lot of beautiful work in studying metacognitive capacities in other animals that many animal species have the ability to track confidence in their actions, to distinguish between making good and bad decisions, even without any external feedback. So these are hallmarks of metacognitive function in humans, and other animals also show them. They also, in studies in mice and in monkeys, we know that some of the neural circuits involved in forming confidence in our behavior, in our decisions and actions, are shared across species. There are brain regions in the prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex in both mice, in monkeys and in humans that show signatures of confidence in our behavior. Now, being able to compute confidence in your behavior is not the sum total of what metacognition is. So one perspective on that is that those circuits are involved in forming these implicit metacognitive estimates, and that you need other machinery to then make that self-aware. So that is a big open question. My guess here is that we will find there are aspects of metacognition that are uniquely human. And the reason I think that is because we see in childhood this longer developmental phase of explicit metacognition that builds on top of these lower level abilities for self-monitoring that are shared with other species. And we know that extra capacity for conscious self-awareness shares brain mechanisms with the ability to think about other minds, to think about other people. So it seems to be quite a social function. And so one idea that is getting increasing support is that the reason metacognition takes so long to develop in childhood and even into adolescence is that we're essentially learning from being part of a social group how to think about other minds and also then how to think about our own mind. And this is an exciting hypothesis because then we can go and test this. We can go and devise experiments to try and understand how self-awareness and thinking about other people may rely on shared mechanisms. And I think those are the aspects that are likely to be uniquely human. But just the ability to self-monitor and track confidence in our actions and so on, we think that's quite widely shared with other animals as well.
Okay, thank you. And how does an adult with good metacognition differ from one with poor metacognition? Could you give some characteristics?
Yeah, so we can measure this in the lab by asking people to carry out simple tasks, and then after every decision they make on the task, such as classifying a set of images or trying to recall things they've learned previously, we then ask them to evaluate their own performance. We ask them how confident they feel in getting the answer right. And if we have lots of those judgments over time, we can then build up a statistical picture of how their metacognitive judgments relate to their actual performance. So the intuition here is that if you're the kind of person who tends to be more confident when they're correct and less confident when they're wrong, then you can be ascribed a high degree of what we call metacognitive efficiency. And so we can fit models, statistical models to those data, and we can derive a single number that we label your metacognitive efficiency. And what we found is that people vary in that number. And they vary in an interesting way because it seems to be quite a general capacity. So if you have good metacognition on one task, you'll also tend to have good metacognition on another task. It's not explained by IQ or other measures of intelligence. So we seem to be picking up a different dimension of people's cognitive function here. So you can be quite smart but actually have poor metacognition, or vice versa. And so what we think characterizes having good or bad metacognition is really the fidelity of those estimates of your own performance. And there are lots of reasons why you might have poor metacognition. And one prominent explanation coming out of recent models, both in across different labs around the world, is that one key reason metacognition might fail is that these higher order systems that we talked about earlier, that probably are linked to these brain networks that are deep in the brain, that are integrating information from different modalities, if they are not properly tracking the uncertainty you have about different sources of information, then that can lead you to be over or underconfident about your performance. So this is a big area of investigation at the moment, trying to understand the best model of why metacognition fails.
And how can we see the difference of good and bad metacognition in daily life? So you've described an experiment, but if we're just looking on some people, so how can we see it?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So one thing to say there is that it's actually quite difficult to tell from the outside whether someone has good or bad metacognition. So unlike other physical or cognitive abilities, metacognition is quite hidden. It's not obvious just by looking at someone whether they're being self-aware, right? Unless they tell you, then it's all hidden. So one focus here has been on examining the consequences of poor metacognition for future behavior. And there are lots of interesting findings suggesting that having good metacognition is really powerful in making sure that you're adapting your future behavior to be consistent with your current skills and abilities. So to give you an example, imagine if I'm deciding whether to pursue maths or music at school. That decision needs to rest on my understanding of whether I'm going to be good at those subjects, whether they're going to be easy to learn for me, whether they're going to be enjoyable. And all of these factors rely on me thinking about myself. Like, am I the kind of person who is going to enjoy learning this subject? And a lot of those thought processes are hidden, but they have a big impact on the choices we go on to make. And so if you have poor metacognition, then you might think, yeah, I'm really good at something, and decide to pursue it at school or in your career and actually not be doing very well. Or vice versa. You might think, we're very interested, for instance, in gender differences, in why boys and girls think they're better or worse at maths and science. So a common finding is that girls think they're worse in primary school, and secondary school they think they're worse at maths and science, even though there's no difference in actual ability. And so there's lots of studies showing that metacognitive judgment you make then has practical consequences. People then don't choose to do those subjects because they think they're not good enough for them. So it's really important to think about, like, how does the metacognitive aspect guide behavior? And there's lots of powerful examples showing how inaccurate metacognition, thinking you're better or worse than you really are at different tasks or areas of daily life, can then have detrimental consequences to the choices you make.
Have you met or observed the examples of people who have tracked that their metacognitive skills are low, so they could be improved?
I mean, we've studied plenty of people in the lab who don't have very good metacognition, and we've also done some work showing that you can change your metacognition, you can improve it. It's not fixed. It's responsive to feedback, and people seem to be able to learn over time to become more or sometimes less metacognitive on particular tasks. There is some evidence to show that engaging in regular meditation has benefits for metacognition that go beyond mere task performance that go above the cognitive level. But I think part of your question is aiming at, do people self-realize they have poor metacognition and then engage in ways of improving that. And that's very interesting. And I don't think we know the answer to that. One tricky thing about metacognition is that it's often hard to measure without devising more objective metrics, because by definition, if you have poor metacognition, you're probably not going to realize that you do, because you need that metacognitive capacity to have the self-awareness to realize you have poor metacognition. That said, it's an oversimplification to think there's just one level of metacognition or one capacity. And we've been interested recently in work we've been doing in the lab in pursuing the idea that there's a hierarchy of self-estimates, that you can track your performance on a moment-to-moment basis. So that's what we call a local metacognitive judgment. But you also then can think about your skills and capacities over longer timescales. And that's what we call global judgments. So a local judgment would be thinking to yourself, yeah, I got that question right on that exam. And a global judgment would be thinking to yourself, yeah, I'm really good at this subject, or I have a good memory, or I'm an intelligent person. That's the kind of global level of metacognition. And we've done some recent studies on this. We've got one paper that's just been published on this, showing that your global beliefs about yourself are sensitive to fluctuations in local confidence. It makes sense, right? So if I have repeated experiences of not performing a task very well, then I'll start to think on a more global level that I'm not very good at it. But what we've shown is that differs across people depending on how prone to anxiety and depression they are. So if people are more anxious or depressed, they will be less sensitive to signals, to local metacognitive signals that tell them that they're actually doing quite well. And so that we think that could explain why people who are more anxious or depressed tend to have a very negative view of their own skills and capacities.
Mm-hmm. And is there something else that impacts our metacognitive skills? So, for example, if I have generally good metacognition, but I'm stressed or I have an anxiety, then my skills will be more poor. But is there anything else that impacts my metacognition?
Yeah, so anxiety is interesting because what our data suggests is that it's not that you have poor metacognition when you're anxious. If anything, you might have slightly better metacognition because you're more sensitive to your errors. You're more focused on noticing your own mistakes. And so that can actually improve your monitoring. And in our data, it definitely doesn't decrease it. It's people who are anxious are good at metacognitively, but they're just generally at a global level underconfident. They just think their skills and capacities are not as good as they should be. In terms of stress, that's a different picture. So stress, both acute and chronic stress, appear to, there's not very many studies on this, but there are 3 or 4 papers on this. Those data suggest that stress can negatively impact metacognition, even if performance on simple tasks is intact. So what this suggests to me is that what stress is doing is really decreasing this capacity to notice your own mistakes. So you might, for a while at least, you might be able to perform simple tasks reasonably well. But as soon as you encounter a situation where you need to be self-aware of potential mistakes or errors and change strategy or embark on something novel or complicated, then I think that's going to cause major problems because that metacognitive capacity is missing to allow you to take a step back and reflect on whether you're doing a good job or not. In terms of other factors that go beyond mental health and stress, we know that there are subtle cultural differences between people's metacognitive abilities. This is, again, an early area of research. We've done one study we published a couple of years ago showing that people who grew up in China, in Beijing, had slightly better metacognition than people who grew up in the West, in the UK and the US. We don't know why that is, but it was a surprising finding. So we decided to try and replicate it in a new experiment, and we found exactly the same thing with a different set of people. So we think it's real. We don't know why, but I think it's another result that is consistent with the what I was saying earlier, which is that our conscious awareness of our skills and capacities and our performance is not something we're born with. It's something that is shaped throughout our childhood and adolescence. We essentially get taught informally by our parents, our teachers, to think about ourselves and how we're performing, and it doesn't surprise me that there would be cultural variation in how that process is communicated to children, and that seems to then lead to differences in metacognition in adult life.
Mm-hmm. And I also was wondering, is there anything that parents should consider now who are listening to this podcast to make their kids more metacognitively sensitive?
Well, yeah, it's hard to... so I can certainly give some suggestions, but they wouldn't... The caveat to this is that we don't know very much from the science at the moment on what is a good or bad thing to do for the development of metacognition. Just because there are, as I said before, there are just so few studies looking at longitudinal development of metacognition. And part of the reason for this is that it's surprisingly hard to measure, and it's only really been in the past 10 years or so that psychologists have developed good measures of metacognitive function. So we're now in a position to start doing the kind of studies that we'd want to do to know the answers to your questions. But I think what we can do is offer some suggestions based on our current understanding of how metacognition works. And one, I think, powerful component there is the growing evidence that metacognition, this explicit aspect of self-awareness that takes a while to develop in childhood, shares resources in the brain with the ability to think about other minds, to think about others. So anything that can encourage kids to be social, to think about how others are thinking and feeling. And one really lovely way of doing this is by reading books with them, by reading stories, by talking through the characters in these stories, like, oh, how do you think this character is feeling? And just any prompt that can help the kids realize that other people have a different view of the situation to themselves. My guess, and this is again, it's just a guess, this will be helpful for thinking about their own minds and their own thoughts and feelings.
Thank you. I hear that it's a guess, and but I guess also that soon you'll have some studies. On this topic also.
Yeah.
So, from my point of view, one of the benefits of good metacognition is an ability to be confident in your decisions, but on the right level, so not underconfident and not overconfident. And from your experience, why don't we believe in our abilities, even if we are fully capable of achieving the desired outcome?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier about self-belief on a more global level and how that's connected in to our local moment-to-moment metacognitive judgments of ourselves. I think we know a lot more about how the local moment-to-moment confidence is formed and how we monitor for mistakes and errors on a moment-to-moment basis on a very local timescale. And we know much less about how these global beliefs about our skills and abilities are formed. I think that one natural way of starting to explain some of those discrepancies is by trying to find cases in which those linkages break down. And so to give you two examples of how this can help explain changes in self-belief, one would be what I just mentioned earlier about the people with more anxiety or depression symptoms. There they seem to not to integrate properly their own instances of high confidence on a task. So what's fascinating about these data is that people who are anxious or depressed can still be very confident they got a decision correct on a local level, on a moment-to-moment basis. They can be just as confident as the next person, but they don't use that as a signal to update their global belief that they're doing well. for some reason. There's a disconnect between these moment-to-moment signals of being confident and getting the answers right and doing a good job, and these more global beliefs about yourself. Another example of that disconnect is that we've also studied patients who have what are called functional neurological disorders. And functional disorders are a class of brain disorders where the patients will think that their memory or cognitive or motor function is impaired, even though the clinical tests show that it's fine, it's intact. Mm-hmm. So this is really a disorder of metacognition. So people will be convinced that their memory is terrible, even though when it's actually fine, for instance. And we've done some studies to show that that is due to a selective change in how these global beliefs are being formed about their capacities. So we think that an important general result here is that how the beliefs we hold about our skills and capacities are not fixed, and it's something the brain needs to construct. And it's not easy to do that. And so there are lots of opportunities for that to go awry and there to be a disconnect between the belief we have and the objective reality.
Mm-hmm. Is it valid to say that a piece of advice for such people could be that you need to project your current successes on the larger scale?
Yeah, so I see what you mean. So as in like to try and ensure that connection is intact? Yeah, I think that's an interesting thought. So I think the general point from our studies would be that to have accurate beliefs about yourself, it's important to be sensitive to local successes and failures, like not to focus more on one or the other. So it's equally bad to not pay attention to the failures as well, right? So you don't want to be overconfident thinking everything's fine when actually you're messing things up. So there's a balance. You want to be equally sensitive to both. But yes, absolutely. I think it's particularly problematic and pernicious if people have a generalized underconfidence and they're not, quotes, listening to their own performance. They're not sensitive to those instances of local success. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And also, considering confidence topic, there is such a thing as a self-fulfilling prophecy. When we don't believe in our success and we are more likely to skip opportunities, for example, that might help us achieve the desired outcome. And in daily life, not in some global context, but just day to day, does it mean that generally it is better to have a little bit overconfidence than a lack of it?
Yeah, this is a super interesting question. So there was a nice study done by two academics at Harvard a few years ago showing that if you simulate little agents in a computer game that are all competing for resources, then if you then make the decision about whether to compete or not dependent not on their objective ability but on how they believe, if you make it dependent on their beliefs about their ability, then what they showed is it's optimal to not have a perfectly accurate picture of yourself. What you want is to be slightly overconfident, because that then prompts you to get involved in the competition in the first place. So it's almost like pushing you to take a bit more of a risk. But it was a lovely paper because it suggested that counterintuitively, you don't necessarily want an accurate picture of yourself. It's actually perhaps adaptive to be slightly overconfident. What I argue in the book is that there's a tension here between having a more global level of slight overconfidence that will push you to do things that maybe you otherwise wouldn't have done. So it prompts exploration, helps you get out of bed in the morning, helps you engage in new endeavors, while at the same time having a high level of local metacognitive sensitivity so that you're able to recognize when you're making mistakes or when you're making errors. So that's kind of the optimal combination. A slight overconfidence at the global level, but acute awareness of making errors at the local level.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. One more topic I'd like to discuss is decision making, and does the science of metacognition answer why it may be so difficult to make decisions?
Interesting. So, I think one thing it does, it can offer a new perspective on whether we should be comfortable with uncertainty and whether we should be comfortable with not jumping to a conclusion too quickly. So what the science of metacognition suggests is that it's important to be open to new information that's coming in, to be open to changing your mind, because what the danger is that you make a decision, and if you then become unnecessarily confident in that initial decision, then that might shut down any future tendency to reflect on or think about whether that's a good decision. So one way in which metacognition controls the decision process is that it essentially controls the window of integration of information. So both before you make a decision, but also afterwards. And so we've studied this in the lab. We've given people decisions where we've given them information after they've made a choice, new information after they've made a choice. And we've looked to see whether people change their mind or stick with their original decision. And what we found is that metacognition plays a role in shaping whether you're going to integrate that new information or not. So if you tend to be more confident in your decision initially, then we've shown that using measures from brain imaging, we've shown that people's brains are much less sensitive to that new information that's coming in. Whereas if you're less confident, then your brain is in a state that's open to that new information, and that enables you to effectively change your mind. Now, what's interesting about that is that that is all fine as long as you have good metacognition, because those when you have low confidence, those will be cases where you are likely to be screwing up, making a mistake. But if you have poor metacognition, then there will be cases where you're confident, but you're actually wrong, but then you don't take on board new information because you've shut it down. We've done some studies to show that it's those situations that are most dangerous for updating our beliefs and making good decisions. Because in those situations, you can get very rigid or dogmatic in your thinking because you think you know the right answer, but it's actually just because you're too confident in that initial response. And that means that you've then stopped any further consideration of the evidence.
Mm-hmm. I guess the problem for some people, or for a lot of people, I don't know the statistics, is that people tend to look for a perfect decision and to be super confident, but actually from what you're saying, it's not required. So you'd better make a decision and leave some underconfidence to explore other options, maybe to adjust your decision.
Yeah, essentially that's what I'm saying. But I think it's also important to recognize that there are different things that people might be trying to optimize here. So to make a good decision, you'd want to sit with uncertainty, allow new information to come in, continually reflect on the previous judgments you're making. But you might also be trying to optimize leading other people, ensuring that you communicate confidence to a group. There, the evidence suggests that people who are perceived as decisive and confident, and they know what they're doing, and that's good for leadership and for creating a group that will be getting on board with your vision. So again, there's a tension there. And I think this comes back to what we were saying before about the benefits of overconfidence. At the global level, you might want to project confidence, especially in a social setting. You might want to reassure everyone that you know what you're doing. But in private, for making good decisions, the science is very clear that it's adaptive and optimal to ensure you keep an open mind about new information, potentially revising previous choices.
Mm-hmm. Is it about the term you use, intellectual humility?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so intellectual humility would be a kind of catch-all term for essentially combining these two aspects in an effective way. So, good leaders with intellectual humility will project that reassurance and confidence, but will also not think they have all the answers. They will also listen to others. They will also seek advice when they don't feel confident in making a decision. And so that combination from a lot of different sources seems to be a very powerful one.
Mm-hmm. I just loved that you've mentioned in a book several times that some people with poor metacognitive skills, especially in politics, yeah, or some governmental issues, they tend to be overconfident and close their outlook for new information. So they do not seek any new evidence, and they stay true to their initial beliefs that may be wrong. Yeah. So it's better to always be open. It sounds easy and it sounds obvious, but it's not that obvious for a lot of people.
Absolutely. No, and as you say, we've found in our studies when we've looked across large samples of people, we found links between not being willing to take on board corrective information and having more extreme political views and more rigid views. So thinking that you know the answer or you have the right outlook and everyone else has the wrong outlook. And so it does seem to be that, having more sensitive metacognition, particularly on this local level, to kind of be constantly second guessing yourself, checking whether you think you have the right information, is linked to being more moderate and open-minded. But again, we need to think about what are we trying to optimize over the long run? If we look at human history, there are many cases where people were absolutely rigid and dogmatic and thought this was the right thing to do, and they've often changed the world, for good as well. So there's kind of like this tension, as I said before, where if you want to lead and you want to change something, you may need to, at least in public, be communicating a very confident message where you say, I know this is the right thing to do. But in private, that's where you'd want the self-awareness to kick in.
Mm-hmm. To build this message that you would love to show the public.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and to conclude, I would love also to ask about some steps that each person can make to start improving their metacognitive skills. So you've already mentioned meditation, but maybe you can tell more.
Yeah, so I mean, there are a few studies on meditation suggesting they have benefits for these objective measures of local metacognition. A few we've already touched upon, this notion of being sensitive to your own successes and failures in different domains. I think a very powerful one is relying on trusted feedback from colleagues, from friends, getting into the habit of, if you have an important meeting that you've been preparing for a long time for, get into the habit of, if you have a colleague that you trust, you can just ask them quickly afterwards, is there anything you think I should have done differently there? People don't tend to do that. They feel socially a bit awkward about doing that. But it's an extremely powerful way of changing your awareness of your own strengths and weaknesses. And obviously that's systematized in many workplaces in the form of 360 feedback and appraisals. But it's more the informal kind of ability to check in with an external perspective that can become powerful. And I guess a third thing would be related to what we talked about earlier about stress, where under acute stress, people can often shut down those metacognitive capacities. And while you might be able to continue performing in the short term, over the longer term, then performance could suffer because your metacognition is less in gear. And so one useful way of improving metacognition is to recognize those pressure situations, and if it's a high stakes scenario, if it really requires this third person perspective to make sure you're not going to make a major error, being able to recognize those high pressure scenarios and take a step back so that you can engage in the necessary metacognition, the necessary self-awareness of potential success and failure, is again a powerful strategy that comes out of the neuroscience of this area.
Mm-hmm. And what aspect of your work, maybe of your findings during your research, has changed your life?
Interesting. I think that one thing that has changed for me is I'm now acutely aware of the fact that our beliefs about success and failure, our beliefs about performance, our confidence in being able to get something done or not, is very much a construction. It's not something that is rooted entirely in objective reality. And that's helpful to know, because there are obviously times, like with any of us, where we feel we can't do something, or we don't feel great that day and think we're a failure and so on. So it's not always easy to then put into practice the change of that that belief about ourselves, but just the knowledge that it doesn't necessarily reflect the reality of who we are is a useful thing. And I guess another area that this comes in is the having self-awareness of how, say, a response to negative feedback is likely to play out over time can also be very powerful in ensuring we don't pay too much attention to those emotional feelings. And so one example from my own work is, I run a science lab. We're always submitting research papers and applying for grants. And the world of science is very much based on getting anonymous reviews from other scientists about whether your work is good or bad, essentially. Mm-hmm. And when you are a student starting out in the field and you get a negative review, you feel like the world is crumbling. You feel like the things that your career is over, and it's a very negative emotional experience. But over time, with experience, you start to realize that that's just the way that kind of feedback makes you feel. It's not a reflection of an external reality. Now, obviously, you need to take on board the actual feedback you're getting about the science and so on. But in terms of the emotional response, I think I've definitely learned over time to realize that external feedback can create a whole suite of emotional reactions that are often not very helpful in moving on from that incident. So that's not necessarily about the science of metacognition. That's probably just about getting older. But it kind of intersects with this general notion that the beliefs about our own skills and capacities are not rooted in reality. Not all the time, anyway.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Still very valuable. It doesn't matter what is the basis, but it sounds very very helpful, and I guess our listeners will have this feedback and have these tools to apply in their everyday lives. So thanks a lot for sharing your insights today, and it's still and was a pleasure to have this conversation.
Thanks, Anna. It was great.
That's all for today. If you found this episode useful, share the podcast link with the people who matter to you. Also, if you'd like to support my work, the best way to say thank you is to subscribe to the podcast on the platform you listen to it. And if you have a moment, drop a comment to let me know what you enjoyed. See you in the next episodes.